In the last video, we looked at setups and why they're a necessity if you want to be fast on Assetto Corsa Competizione. Well, imagine you're driving, you're leading, you got a good setup underneath you, and you get to the pit stop and you don't have a clue what you're doing, and you throw it all down the toilet. And that's why you got to watch this episode, as we cover weather, pit stops, and strategy. And you've seen 2 of these episodes now, hopefully. If you haven't, go back and watch them. But there's 4 left to go. We're going to cover some very interesting topics, and of course, I'm going to try and make them as simple and as understandable as possible. We'll get to the wet conditions in a minute, but I just want to let you know how some of the really fast guys get insanely fast lap times in hot lap mode, which is offline. They make sure the track grip level was an optimum, with it being cloudy, and having the track at around 17 degrees Celsius, maybe even a little bit cooler than this. And the way you can adjust that is by changing the ambient temperature and the time of day. It bemused me at first when I saw these times on YouTube, and I was like, I can't do those times online, but it's all to do with the conditions and what we've just talked about, so yeah, now you know. It's worth saying though, developing a setup like this for an online race is probably not the smartest thing to do. I'd watch my next episode of the series, which will be based solely around setting up a dedicated server on ACC, which will give you the ability to set your own conditions whenever you want. It will give you the ability to practice with friends and teammates as well. I feel like that episode in general is going to help a lot of people out. In an offline or online session, you'll be able to see in the MFD what state the track is in. So if it's dry, it'll either be fast or optimum in most scenarios. Fast is on average about 6/10 to a second slower than an optimum track, depending on the track. But it's the same for everyone. If you do find yourself going that little bit slower, check the track state, see what it is, because it might not be a you problem. In the wet conditions, it will just say wet, so that makes it nice and simple. What I would say, when comparing ACC to reality, a difference I notice is that in real life, when you move offline onto the marbles, in some scenarios, going into the next corner, it can feel like you're driving on ice. The marbles are a huge hindrance in reality in terms of the grip levels, whereas in the game, if you move offline, you can hear the marbles rattling away underneath you, but you'll still have grip when you enter the next corner, which, to be honest, is not realistic. The effect in game isn't as extreme as it should be if the main intention is to mimic reality. In the first episode, we talked about the basic driving techniques required to drive in the wet on ACC, and to be honest, they were very similar to driving in the dry conditions, but just doing everything that little bit slower. If you haven't watched it, please do go and watch it. It's in the card above. I feel like with this series, if you don't watch all the episodes, it's not going to work. It won't make complete sense, and I'm trying to find that balance between teaching those who need teaching, but at the same time not teaching those people who know this stuff to go and suck eggs. And it's a hard balance to find, but I hope I'm doing a decent job. But anyways, it's worth saying that tyre pressures are the most important thing in ACC to know and understand. It's a very dark art getting them right in all scenarios and situations the majority of the time. If your pressures are out of the windows in both the wet and dry conditions, you'll just be slower, there's no doubt about it. It doesn't matter what you do with your driving, you'll just be throwing away lap time in every single corner. As you play the game more and more, you'll know what to pressure the tyres at depending on how wet the track is. You won't always get it right, as the conditions will be impossible to predict as the session goes on, but in a race situation, having a broad selection of strategies can be very helpful. If you do the hard work of testing to see what tyre pressures are good for what conditions, then you'll be ready for any situation that gets thrown your way in the race regarding the weather conditions. As I mentioned earlier, when you can set up your own online server, it makes this whole process a lot easier. If you didn't know, ambient air temperature and track temperature are both things you need to understand and know in Assetto Corsa Competizione. Track temperature obviously goes up with ambient temperature, and in most cases, the hotter the track, the slower it becomes. The amount of cloud cover along with the time of day are both factors that change what the ambient and track temperatures are going to be. If you configure a setup where you set the tyre pressures for say a 25 degree track, when you join the online race and to your surprise it's 35 degrees track, the pressures you've saved will result in the tyre pressures being over pressured, so you just need to have these things in the back of your mind. I usually practice on a 34 degree track, then I save the setups with the number 34 in the name so I don't forget. Then I know if I join the online race I've practiced for and it's 23 degrees track, for example, I'll add some pressure into the tyres. Basically, in simple terms, on a hotter track you need to decrease the tyre pressures, and on a colder track you need to increase the tyre pressures. Staying on top of these situations throughout practice, qualifying and the race is key. Using the in-game weather prediction overlay is critical as well. Despite the fact it's not always 100% accurate in terms of timing, it's still a good way to foresee what you might need to do with the next set of tyres and the pressures. It's the same situation in the wet conditions. A wetter track means you've got to put more pressure in the tyres, a drier track requires lower tyre pressures. In terms of the transition phase, say you're on slicks and it starts raining, When do you go from slicks to wets? Well, the game does tell you this. It comes up with a little notification, and that optimal transition phase is usually a lap or two after this notification comes up. But to be honest, every situation's different. It can rain heavier sometimes compared with other scenarios, so you never really know. What I would say is wait for that notification and then judge the situation for what you're feeling underneath you. The same goes for the flip situation. Say you're on wets, going on to slicks, wait for the notification to come up before changing the tyres, but make sure you're moving offline wherever possible to cool down the wets with the remaining standing water that's on the track. A little side note that I probably forgot to mention in episode 1, this is a common thing I see people get wrong in ACC, and it hurts them badly over the course of a race stint. The mistake I'm referring to is when you use the steering to turn the car too much. Sounds a bit weird, but let me explain. If you try to solve understeer with more and more steering lock, you'll kill the front tyres completely, which will make the issue worse, corner by corner, lap by lap. Make sure you use the brake and the throttle along with the weight transfer to induce some rotation to get the car through the corners. If you just rely on the steering, you'll be useless over a race stint. You might get away with it in quali, but you'll be exposed in the race as your tyre wear will be horrendous. The reason this has such an extreme consequence in ACC is because the tyre model is very realistic, but it's a good thing because it means if you want to be fast, you've got to drive properly. In endurance racing, pit stops and strategy are arguably just as important as raw pace, and there are many different elements to it. So to start with though, let's look at the fuel calculation. I use a very simple calculation to get this right before every single race. So 60 seconds multiplied by the number of minutes your race is, divide this number by your lap time in seconds, then multiply this number by the amount of fuel you use per lap, which can be found in the HUD. I always add about 5 litres to be safe, probably a bit too safe, but it's a reliable way to calculate the fuel you'll need for a race. Alternatively, there's a link in the description below which will take you to an online calculator where it will do this for you. So if you're feeling lazy, go and give that a look. Tyre data, as we've already talked about in this video, is very important, and getting those pressures right is key. In the setup, under the pit stop strategy section is where you adjust the strategy. It's saved to the specific setup you have open, so make sure you save it every time you make a tweak. I've forgotten to do this many a time and it sucks. I always have 3 strategies at the ready for a league race. So strategy 1 for changing dry tyres and adding fuel, very simple. Strategy 2 for changing to wet tyres that are pressured for the conditions I practiced in, and of course adding fuel. Strategy 3 for changing to wet tyres that are pressured 1.5 psi lower than the strategy 2 tyres, and of course adding fuel. The reasoning behind that final strategy is just in case it rains a small amount, it just gives me another option, and as we all know, the weather can be as random as anything. Of course, if I feel like I need to adjust one of these strategies to ensure it's optimal due to the conditions changing throughout the race, I adjust it on the fly using the in-game MFD. What I would say is be open-minded in the race in terms of what strategy you could use against everyone else. You could fuel the car heavy, for example, at the start, hoping it may rain after everyone else has pitted. So when you jump on the wets at your pit stop, everyone else has got to pit again, and all of a sudden, you look pretty rosy. Another option though could be to not change the tyres at the pit stop. So this will save you a fair chunk of time, and maybe you can make them last until the end of the race. I'm not saying there's a certain formula here to always nail the strategy, but what I would say is be open-minded, know the strategies you have in place already, be organised, be adaptable, don't be afraid to take risks. As long as you've made an attempt to think them through, no risk, no reward. And like all these things, the more races you do, you'll build up a database in your head of all the different scenarios you've been in. As long as you learn from your mistakes in this area, you'll start to see improvements in the strategies and the decisions you make. Having a spotter in races can be really helpful, so if you've got any mates or teammates that will do this for you, it's a massive lifesaver. And as we all know, driving in a race or battling with another car, it's very hard to stay calm and rational, so I'd recommend using a spotter. Unless you're doing a 24-hour race, you won't need to worry about changing brake pads at the pit stop, so make sure you don't change these because they take a bloody long time. Damage is something we all want to avoid getting, but it happens to the best of us, so my best advice in this area would be, in the majority of cases, fix damage if you're in an endurance race. You may lose 10 to 15 seconds in the pits, but over a number of stints, it's crazy how much time you can gain back. In shorter races, I wouldn't even bother fixing the damage. You simply don't have enough time to make up what you've lost in the pits. It also depends if you have bodywork or suspension damage. So suspension damage is worse as the car relies on the suspension more than the bodywork when it comes down to performance. By selecting one of the boxes and deselecting the other box, you can see how much damage you have in either area by seeing how much it affects your pit stop time. So if you have them ticked by accident but have no damage, you won't lose any time in the pits, so don't worry about that. One more final point, and this is a very important one as well. Don't lose time messing around with the MFD whilst you're driving. You don't need to. You know, do it on the straights where you're not distracted, you don't have to multitask. Don't do it going through Maggots Beckett's, because it may feel good, but you will lose time, and as I said earlier, you don't need to. Pit stops in Assetto Corsa Competizione aren't easy, especially under pressure in a race scenario. I'm very happy with the way I do it. It seems, for me anyway, to make it as easy and as simple as possible, which is what you want. So let's run through it. Enter the pits as fast as possible, but with no risk of speeding, of course. Make sure you're in first gear, not second, as the pit speed limiter doesn't engage if you're not in first gear. Next, identify your pit box, line up the car so you can park nice and parallel when you come to a stop. As you approach the box, press the ignition button, either map to I on the keyboard. Coast the car into the box, stop it with the front of your car touching the stop board. If you go just past it or don't quite reach it, it will delay the jacking up process. When you're up on the jacks, it will give you a countdown time, and make sure you press the ignition button again so the icon in the bottom right is green. Press the throttle all the way down with about 5 seconds to go. Just after it counts past the number 1, press the starter button. I have this mapped to S on my keyboard. It's worth noting you should have auto clutch on in the assist menu. This means you won't ever need to touch your clutch pedal at all, which, yes, it's not realistic, but it does mean there's less chance of you making a mistake. My best advice would be to practice the pit entry in both dry and wet conditions. There's time to be gained here, as it's not an obvious thing for everyone to practice. Plus, if you don't, it could catch you out, which will result in a big sad. The game will give you a penalty, of course, if you speed. Changing the drivers in endurance races is fairly easy on this game as well. You simply select the driver in the MFD you want to replace you, as long as they are connected into the server. But you can't do this in any old server. It has to be a legit, specific server set up to incorporate this feature. If you haven't already done so already, I'd really recommend doing an endurance race on ACC with your mates or teammates, because it's a lot of fun. There's so many orgs and leagues out there that do these kind of events, so you're spoiled for choice really, and if you haven't done one already, you're missing out. So quite an in-depth topic, but I think we got it all in for the most part. If I did miss anything, do mention it down below so someone sees it. If you've got any questions, put it down in the comments below as well. I'll try and answer as many as possible. So there's 3 more of these videos yet to come on the channel, so if you don't want to miss them, you know what to do. Subscribe to the channel. But for this video, that is the end. Thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you all very soon.